Have you ever wondered why? Every time you want to watch something, your first thought is Netflix? It's not just because Netflix has great shows. Behind that simple red logo is a carefully designed machine. One that knows what you might want to watch, keeps you engaged, constantly creates new content, and adapts faster than its competitors. While Disney, Amazon, and dozens of other platforms entered the streaming war, Netflix didn't just fight back. It changed the game. But here's the part most people don't realize. Netflix isn't just competing for your money. It's competing for your time. And every time you open the app, Netflix gets another chance to keep you there. So how did a company that once mailed DVDs to people's homes become the platform millions of us instinctively turn to when we want something to watch? And more importantly, what did Netflix figure out that its biggest competitors still haven't? That's the story we're about to uncover. The story begins in 1997 with two very different entrepreneurs, Mark Randolph and Reed Hastings. Randolph came from a marketing and direct mail background, while Hastings had built a successful software company called Pure Software. After Pure Software was acquired, Hastings had the money and experience to explore his next venture. Inspired by the rise of Amazon and the growing possibilities of the internet, the two began searching for a business they could build online. Randolph even carried a notebook everywhere, filling it with ideas, from personalized surfboards and dog food to baseball bats. But most of them had one problem. They weren't the kind of businesses customers would return to again and again. So they started looking for something people could repeatedly pay for, without creating huge extra work with every order. Then Randolph suggested something unexpected: videotapes. It sounded like a great idea, until they realized they were dealing with bulky VHS tapes that were expensive to ship. A physical store like Blockbuster didn't have to pay postage every time someone rented a movie, but an online company would. It seemed like the idea was finished before it had even begun. Then, almost at the perfect moment, a new technology entered the picture: DVDs. They were smaller, lighter, easier to store, and cheap enough to mail. Neither Randolph nor Hastings had even seen a DVD before, but they believed this new format could eventually replace VHS. Suddenly, their crazy idea didn't seem so crazy anymore. The plan was simple. Customers would choose a movie online, they would mail the DVD to their home, and once they finished watching, they could send it back in a prepaid envelope. No driving to a store, no searching through shelves, and eventually, no late fees. But having a good idea was one thing. Turning it into a business was another. By the end of 1997, Mark Randolph and Reed Hastings had turned their idea into a small company with a tiny team, a modest office, and very little money. It was far from glamorous, just cheap furniture, folding tables, and employees willing to accept lower salaries in exchange for stock options if the company succeeded. They also needed a name. After considering several alternatives, they eventually settled on Netflix, combining net for the internet and Flix for movies. On August 29, 1997, the company was officially founded. The team then focused on building its DVD collection. Since DVDs were still a new technology, there weren't many titles available, but Netflix tried to collect as many as possible so customers would have plenty of choices. After months of preparation, the moment finally arrived. At 9 a.m., the Netflix website went live, but nobody knew what to expect. Would anyone actually order a movie? To start things off, Randolph placed the first order himself, choosing casino. A bell connected to the computer rang as the order went through. Then, just moments later, it rang again and again. Real customers were placing orders. But the excitement didn't last long. The website suddenly crashed because the team hadn't expected so much traffic. They rushed to buy more servers, only for the website to crash again. Soon, they were also running out of shipping boxes and even printer ink. It was chaos. But despite all of it, Netflix finished its first day with 137 orders. It was a promising start, but the team soon discovered a much bigger problem. Customers weren't renting DVDs, they were buying them. Netflix had launched with both options, but most people preferred to buy. That brought in immediate revenue, but it wasn't the business Randolph and Hastings wanted to build. Anyone could sell the same DVD, meaning Netflix would eventually have to compete on price. Renting was different because the same DVD could generate revenue again and again. Netflix needed customers to rent, not buy. And just when they were trying to figure out how to make that happen, Amazon came calling. Jeff Bezos was looking to expand Amazon beyond books, and DVDs were an obvious next step. Instead of building an online DVD business from scratch, Amazon considered buying Netflix. For Randolph and Hastings, the offer was tempting. They could make a significant amount of money after only months of work. But they believed Netflix could become something much bigger, so they decided not to sell. Instead, the two companies reached an agreement. Amazon would focus on selling DVDs, while Netflix would focus on renting them. It seemed like the perfect solution, but Netflix still had one major problem. How do you convince people to rent instead of buy? They began experimenting with different promotions, including partnerships with DVD player manufacturers that offered customers free Netflix rentals. The idea was simple: give people a taste of the service and hopefully turn them into paying subscribers. But the promotion quickly went wrong. People found ways to use the serial numbers without even buying a DVD player, and even legitimate customers often disappeared after using their free rentals. Less than 5% became regular paying customers. Netflix was spending money, but failing to build loyalty. Then came another unusual marketing stunt. America was fascinated by the release of Bill Clinton's grand jury testimony involving Monica Lewinsky. Netflix converted the footage to DVD and offered it online for just 2 cents with the slogan, "Have your 2 cents on the Clinton testimony." Newspapers picked up the story, and thousands of people visited Netflix's website. For a moment, it looked like a brilliant marketing stunt. Then disaster struck again. The company Netflix hired to produce the DVDs also handled adult movies. Somehow, some of those discs were accidentally mixed with the Clinton DVDs. Because the discs weren't properly labeled, Netflix didn't discover the mistake until customers had already received them. Netflix apologized and asked customers to return the wrong DVDs. Not one did. And behind all these embarrassing failures was a much bigger problem. Netflix was losing money. The promotions weren't creating enough paying customers, and the Amazon partnership wasn't working as expected. Netflix was sending customers to Amazon, but Amazon wasn't sending many back. After only a short time in business, Mark and Reed were facing a painful question. Had they made the wrong choice? Then came a major turning point. Reed Hastings confronted Mark Randolph, telling him that Netflix had serious problems, especially with decisions around hiring, promotions, and the company's finances. But Hastings didn't stop there. He wanted to become CEO. For Randolph, it was painful. These two men had built Netflix together, and now his own friend was telling him that someone else should lead the company. Yet after thinking it through, Randolph realized Hastings had a point. Hastings had more experience running companies and a stronger reputation with investors, so Randolph accepted the change and moved into the role of president while Hastings became CEO. But changing leadership wasn't enough. Netflix still needed a business model that could actually work. Then, while thinking through the company's problems, Randolph had a breakthrough. What if customers didn't rent one DVD at a time? What if they simply paid a monthly subscription? No deadlines, no late fees, and no pressure to return a movie quickly. Customers could keep several DVDs at home and return them whenever they were ready, then receive new ones in exchange. Suddenly, renting a movie became much more convenient. Instead of thinking, "I need to watch this before I have to return it," customers could simply think, "I'll watch it whenever I want." The response was remarkable. On the first day, around 90% of the people who saw the offer signed up for the subscription plan. Netflix had finally found the business model it had been searching for. DVDs were becoming more popular, DVD players were getting cheaper, and subscribers were beginning to grow. But Netflix wasn't finished innovating. As Netflix's DVD library grew, another problem appeared: choice. The more movies Netflix added, the harder it became for customers to decide what to watch. So Netflix created a recommendation system called Cinematch, which used customer ratings to predict which movies they might enjoy next. But this wasn't just about making customers happier. It also helped Netflix make better use of its inventory. Instead of everyone choosing the newest and most expensive movies, the system could guide people toward other films that match their interests. This made the service more personal, kept customers engaged, and gave Netflix another advantage over traditional rental companies. But just as Netflix was finally finding its way, something much bigger was about to threaten the entire technology industry. In the late 1990s, the internet seemed unstoppable. Investors were pouring money into almost any company with an online business. Netflix was hoping to use that money to grow quickly before larger competitors could catch up. But then, the dot-com bubble burst. Internet stocks collapsed, investors pulled back, and funding suddenly became much harder to find. For Netflix, the timing couldn't have been worse. The company was still tiny compared with Blockbuster. Netflix was expecting around $5 million in revenue in 2000, while Blockbuster was making nearly $800 million from late fees alone. Blockbuster was worth billions, had tens of thousands of employees, and thousands of physical stores. Netflix looked like David facing Goliath. But Netflix had one important advantage. Blockbuster was slow to adapt. While Netflix was building an online DVD business, Blockbuster was still focused on its traditional stores. Netflix knew that if its idea worked, Blockbuster would eventually come after them. The problem was that Netflix needed money to survive long enough to compete. So Mark Randolph and Reed Hastings came up with a desperate idea. What if Blockbuster simply bought Netflix? It sounded like a win for both sides. Netflix would get the money and resources it needed, while Blockbuster could instantly enter the growing online market. But getting Blockbuster to take them seriously would be another story. Netflix managed to secure a meeting with Blockbuster, and Randolph and Hastings quickly flew out to present their idea. They explained that the two companies could complement each other. Blockbuster had the physical stores, while Netflix had the online business. Together, they could dominate both sides of the movie rental market. Then came the question that would decide everything. How much do you want for Netflix? Hastings had his answer ready, $50 million. Blockbuster laughed. To them, Netflix was just a tiny internet company asking for an enormous price in the middle of the dot-com crash. The deal was over before it had even begun. Randolph and Hastings left the meeting disappointed. But the rejection made one thing clear. If Blockbuster wouldn't buy Netflix, Netflix would have to beat Blockbuster. With money becoming harder to find, Netflix had to cut costs. The company laid off around a third of its employees, leaving behind a smaller but more focused team. Then, in 2002, Netflix went public, raising the money it needed to continue growing. And the growth eventually caught Blockbuster's attention. In 2004, Blockbuster launched its own DVD by mail service, copying the model Netflix had built. The battle had officially begun, but Mark Randolph wouldn't be there for it. As Netflix grew, he felt increasingly disconnected from the company he had helped create. He eventually stepped away to focus on other startups. Now, Reed Hastings was running Netflix alone, and the fight with Blockbuster was about to become brutal. Netflix tried several ways to compete with Blockbuster. It experimented with social features, advertising, selling used DVDs, and other ideas. But Reed Hastings soon realized they were making a mistake. Netflix was spreading itself too thin. Instead of trying to do everything, the company needed to focus on one thing and do it better than anyone else. So Netflix returned to its core business while continuing to look ahead. By the mid-2000s, Netflix was shipping more than 1 million DVDs every day. But Hastings knew DVDs couldn't be the future forever. Internet speeds were getting faster, and streaming video was becoming possible. So in 2007, Netflix launched its streaming service. At first, streaming was simply an extra benefit for DVD subscribers, and the library was small. But Netflix understood where the technology was heading. Eventually, customers wouldn't need DVDs at all. They could simply press a button and watch instantly. No shipping, no waiting, no physical stores. Streaming also opened another opportunity, global expansion. With DVDs, Netflix had to deal with shipping and logistics in every country. With streaming, it could reach customers almost anywhere with an internet connection. At the same time, Netflix continued improving its recommendation technology. In 2007, it launched the Netflix Prize, offering $1 million to anyone who could create a better system for predicting what users would want to watch. Netflix was learning that what people say they like isn't always the same as what they actually watch. Their viewing behavior could reveal much more. But Netflix had one major weakness. It didn't own most of the content streamed. At first, licensing movies and shows worked because there wasn't much competition. But as streaming grew, companies like Hulu entered the market, and the studios themselves realized they could launch their own streaming services. If they own the content, why keep giving it to Netflix? Netflix needed something competitors couldn't simply take away: original content. In 2011, Netflix made one of its biggest bets yet. Ted Sarandos found a political drama called House of Cards, but producing it would cost around $100 million. For Netflix, that was an enormous gamble. If the show failed, the company would lose a huge amount of money. But Netflix took the risk. When House of Cards premiered in 2013, it became a major success. Netflix had discovered something bigger than streaming. It could become a studio. From there, Netflix began investing heavily in its own shows and movies. And as competitors started pulling their content from Netflix, original programming became even more important. Netflix no longer had to depend entirely on what other studios were willing to license. Its data gave the company another advantage. Netflix knew what people watched, what they finished, and what they abandoned. That information helped guide decisions about which shows and movies to produce. And because Netflix had subscribers around the world, a successful show didn't have to remain successful in just one country. A Korean series could become a global phenomenon. A Swedish thriller could find millions of viewers thousands of miles away. Netflix had transformed itself once again. It wasn't just delivering entertainment anymore. It was creating it. But another challenge was coming, one that would test Netflix's culture, its business model, and its ability to keep changing. Netflix's business model was unusual, but its company culture was even more extreme. At the center of it was an idea called talent density. The belief was simple. One weak employee can bring down an entire team, while a team full of talented people can push each other to perform at a much higher level. So Netflix didn't try to keep everyone. If an employee was only performing adequately, the company was willing to let them go and find someone better. Netflix called this the keeper test. Managers were encouraged to ask themselves, if this employee left tomorrow, would I fight to keep them? If the answer was yes, they stayed. If not, Netflix would give them a generous severance package and move on. It sounds harsh, but Netflix believed this approach allowed the company to operate with fewer rules. Employees were given freedom over things like vacation and spending, while the company shared an unusual amount of information with its employees. Netflix also encouraged radical honesty, meaning employees were expected to give direct feedback, even to managers and even to Reed Hastings himself. The philosophy was that talented people don't need to be controlled at every step. Give them responsibility, give them freedom, and trust them to make the right decisions. But this culture had its problems. Some employees abused that freedom. Unlimited vacation could make people afraid to take time off, and the constant pressure to perform could create a culture of fear. So Netflix's culture wasn't for everyone. But Reed Hastings believed the benefits outweighed the risks. To him, the biggest danger wasn't making a mistake. It was failing to change. That philosophy had already helped Netflix survive the fight with Blockbuster. But now Netflix was facing a different kind of threat. An entire industry was coming after it. Netflix had helped create the streaming industry. But now, everyone wanted a piece of it. Disney launched Disney+, Amazon and Apple entered the market, and major studios like HBO created their own platforms. The problem was that these companies own the content. Disney could pull its movies from Netflix. HBO could remove its shows. And suddenly, some of the very content that had attracted people to Netflix was disappearing. Shows like Friends and The Office moved to other platforms, forcing Netflix to spend even more money creating its own content. For a while, the strategy worked. Then the pandemic gave Netflix another huge boost. Millions of people were stuck at home, and subscribers grew rapidly. But when life returned to normal, that growth slowed. Then, in 2022, Netflix announced something investors hadn't seen in years. It had lost subscribers. The reaction was brutal. Netflix's share price collapsed, wiping tens of billions of dollars from its market value. Netflix responded by looking for new ways to increase revenue. It raised prices, began cracking down on password sharing, and introduced a cheaper plan with advertisements. But customers weren't happy, and this raised an uncomfortable question. Was Netflix beginning to make the same mistake Blockbuster once made? Netflix also faced another problem: the cost of original content. The company was spending enormous amounts of money producing shows and movies, but spending more doesn't always mean producing better content. If hundreds of millions are spent on shows that fail to attract viewers, the model becomes harder to sustain. And when Netflix cancels shows after only a few seasons, customers may become less willing to invest their time in something new. Meanwhile, competitors like Disney have enormous libraries of content that audiences already love. So Netflix was fighting a streaming war on multiple fronts. But the biggest threat wasn't another streaming service. It was something Netflix couldn't simply buy, license, or defeat with more movies. It was the battle for people's attention. After the shock of 2022, Netflix had to change its strategy. Subscriber growth was slowing. So instead of focusing only on getting more users, Netflix needed to make more money from the customers it already had. One of its biggest moves was cracking down on password sharing. For years, Netflix had tolerated people sharing accounts outside their households. But as growth slowed, the company began charging extra for it. It was unpopular at first, but Netflix pushed ahead. Then came another major change: advertising. In 2022, Netflix introduced a cheaper subscription plan with ads. It was a major shift for a company that had built its brand around ad-free entertainment. But it gave Netflix a new source of revenue and another way to attract price-conscious customers. Netflix also continued expanding beyond traditional movies and TV, investing in games and live programming, while focusing more on revenue and profit rather than simply chasing subscriber numbers. And the strategy began to pay off. By 2025, Netflix had reached around $45 billion in annual revenue, showing that the company had once again adapted to a changing market. But perhaps the most fascinating part of Netflix's story is how often it changed. It started by selling and renting DVDs, then created a subscription service, moved into streaming, and eventually became a Hollywood studio. Even when growth slowed, Netflix changed again, adding advertising, games, and live content. Netflix didn't succeed because it found one perfect business model. It survived because it kept adapting. And that may be the biggest lesson of its entire journey. The companies that survive aren't always the ones with the biggest advantage, but the ones willing to change before that advantage disappears. Almost 3 decades later, Netflix is still doing what it has always done, reinventing itself. And if you enjoy business stories like this, hit like and subscribe to Business Mastery.